Hi there. I was at a quilt show recently and a couple of ladies were looking at some of my quilts and patterns and were interested in the way that I like to applique the best, because many of my quilts have some simple blanket stitch applique on them. And I said, well, the blanket stitch is just the best for me. Most of the time, if I'm doing raw edge applique, I use a blanket stitch on the applique. Here are some examples of just a couple of examples from my quilts. This is from Groovy Gears. The blanket stitch is this stitch right here. It goes, let me see if I can point it out. It goes down and in and back out and down and in and back out and down. Now this is a single blanket stitch. You can do a double blanket stitch, but usually a single blanket stitch is what I prefer. It's faster, it's easy, and it covers very nicely. Here's another quilt with some blanket stitching on it. And these, I think I tried to find thread that matched the color, but it's a good way to cover your raw edges, and according to what I have learned from other professional quilters, the blanket stitch is very, very hardy, and you can wash your quilt and dry your quilt, and it's not going to cause that to come off or start to fray. A lot of times on my wall quilts I will use a blanket stitch. Here's on this circle flower, I have the blanket stitch. It's not hard to do. Most sewing machines have that stitch on them, and I'm going to show you what my machine does, or how you set the machine up for the blanket stitch. Before we're actually ready for stitching though, if you're doing raw edge fusible applique, there are a couple things you need to think about. So we're going to go over to the ironing board, because I have a piece of fabric that I've already put some fusible on. This is just probably a piece out of one of these things. And so it already has the fusible on the back. My preferred fusible is Steam a Seam 2 Light. So it has the Steam a Seam on the back, and I'm going to put it on this. I found this piece of white cotton. It's best if you're going to put something on a background, it's best if your background fabric has been starched or sprayed with some sort of sizing, so that it's pretty stiff. We do want it ironed, and I try to make it as stiff as I can. Sometimes I even will use a stabilizer underneath, especially if I think I'm going to do some fancy stitching on top of that. Okay, so I'm going to peel off my fusible. And I'm hoping, this is old enough, but I'm hoping that it will stick on here. If not, I have another one that will work. And I am going to stick it in the middle. I'm just sticking it here to use as an example. I think it's stuck down pretty well. Here's another example. Sometimes we have 2 or 3 different things piled on top of one another. This little flower with the spiral, when I cut out my fusible, I cut out the circle inside so that there wouldn't be 2 layers of fusible. If possible, always try to keep the layers down so that your applique doesn't get too sticky. So if I were using this one, I would, now I could take off this fusible, stick it down, and the fusible is only on the outside where I'll be stitching. And then when I stitch around here, there's enough fabric underneath that it will still hold the stitching well. So this is ready to be stitched now, and I'm going to go to the sewing machine and set up my camera so that you can see how I do the blanket stitch or buttonhole stitch. Alright, I'm at my sewing machine now. I have a Bernina sewing machine. I love it, but most machines will have the capability of doing a good blanket stitch. I've already put thread in, and for this, when I'm doing the blanket stitch, I try to use, usually I use a fatter, fuller thread, unless it's something that I don't want to be seen very well. But this is just black cotton thread. In my bobbin today, I have black cotton thread, but usually I will use something that's lightweight, like a 60 to 70 weight bobbin thread, because we don't want our bobbin thread to show. In setting up my machine, there's a couple of things that I always do. First of all, I am going to find the button for the blanket stitch. On my machine, that button is in this folder, and it's 1329. And then 1329 does a stitch that's 2.3 wide and 2.6 long. I usually do either 2.5 or 2.0. I think I'm going to do 2.5 so that you can see it today. And so then I'm also going to do 2.5 wide. And now over here, the tension for that is 3.25. That is I always take my tension down because I don't want it to be that much. So I'm going to take my tension down to 2.5. And finally, the last thing I do, but it's really an important thing, is I go here and I put my needle onto the far right position. So, and now if you look at my needle down here, oh, and I also have an open-toed throat plate. I have my open-toe foot, and I don't have my even feed section down. I need that. And see where the needle is? It's at the very far right. So I am going to do a little blanket stitching. I oftentimes, before I start, will just take a piece of scrap and make sure, and I didn't have anything close by. This is another piece of scrap. I'm going to just try this out to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. So I'm going to take if I could find my thread, I'm going to put my needle down and I'm going to pull it up, because when I start, that's what I will do. And then I'm going to pull up the bobbin thread. That way I can hold on to both of them. And I am going to take a stitch down, and it goes, there you see how the bobbins or the blanket stitch goes. It goes down, over, down, in. So it just follows along. Now the reason we have our needle over to the right is so we can have it on the very edge of our whatever we're appliquing. It looks like it's doing okay. If when I test this on my practice piece, if I see any bobbin thread coming up, I will usually just take that tension and put it down a little farther. All right, so now I am going to start somewhere on the outside of my whatever it is I'm appliquing, and I am going to find my thread, which is here. So, oh, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to find my thread. Nope, that's the wrong thread. Where's my top thread? Goodness sake. well, maybe it, whoop. Okay, well, I don't see it, and it's not there. Okay. All right. Now I have both threads. I am setting this foot right down so that this edge of the applique is right almost to this side of my foot. And you can see where my needle is going to come down. It's going to come down right there. Well, I'm going to go ahead and take one stitch, and then I'm going to come up, and I'm going to pull the bobbin thread up and pull it out so that I can hold on to it. Now, I don't know if you can see, but if you look, the needle is going to come down now over here. I don't want that. I have to start back at the beginning. So I am going to, on my machine, I am going to hit the button which takes the stitch back to the start point. Now I'm ready to go. So I'm going to go down, in, down, in, down, in, down, in, down. And now I see that I need to turn just slightly. What you are looking at when you are blanket stitching is this back of the foot, or back of where the place that you can see on the foot. You want your stitch to go parallel to that or perpendicular to the edge. So I think I can go down and take one more stitch, go out. I'm going to turn it just a little, stitch, out. Notice whenever I stop when the needle is out at the very edge. And go slowly around. Okay, now I've gone around this outside, and I'm getting close to a pointy area. Sometimes it's good when you get close to a pointy area or a small, if you're doing something small, it's good to take your size of stitch down and maybe the length of the stitch. So I'm going to take this down to a 2.0 on my machine and a 2.0 length. You won't see a whole lot of difference, but there's a little bit of difference. When I get to the end at that point, I'm going to try to get it to go right. Okay, and then I'm going to come back around. Now I think I can go back to the original 2.5 and 2.5. Remember when you are doing the blanket stitch that you're always doing the stitching so that the applique is the part that's getting the bite. The blanket or the background area is usually the part that gets it's always the part that gets the straight stitch. So sometimes it will, if you have something that's opposite of what I'm sewing here, you would be sewing maybe in the opposite direction. Okay, I think I'm going to stop now. Hopefully this little blanket stitch, oh, maybe I better tell you what you do when you get to the end. So let me go ahead and finish, and then we'll finish up. Okay, I've taken my last stitch. As you can see, here's my last stitch. Here's where I started. So I'm ready to just take one more stitch, and I'm going to pull him out of the machine and leave the threads. Let's go over here and perhaps I can show you what I do next, because I've got three threads on top and one sticking out the bottom. I usually take a needle that is either called a self-threading or an easy threader needle, and I pull these threads just into that eye. I stick them back into the fabric right at the edge, and then I'm going to pull them to the back. Now, these are kind of long. That's okay. And I'm just going to knot them in the back, or sometimes I can thread them through here. Usually I just knot them off and they're covered up. And that doesn't look as good as it could, but it's going to do it for me. So now I have my, I guess it's a 6 or it's a 9, but it's a blanket stitch or a buttonhole stitch. It's very easy, and you can use it on lots and lots of fusible raw edge applique. Thank you for watching. And if you feel like you learned something from this presentation, go ahead and hit that like button. And while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe so you'll be notified when the next video comes along.